Welcome to how to make an Elle dress. So I was gonna make this a made-to-order item on my website this month for April, and I kind of changed my mind on everything and I'm not taking orders anymore. But I was really excited about this dress, so I thought that I would show you how to make it yourself. It's actually pretty straightforward. It is just a series of rectangles that are sewn together and then just some shirring on the top. So you can watch my video on shirring to figure out how to do that. It's also very straightforward once you have like the elastic thread that you'll need for it, but this is super simple and it'll be very easy for you to make. You just need some of your own measurements and you'll be good to go. So let's get into it. Okay, so there's two main measurements that you'll need for this, and that is your bust and your desired length. So for the bust, you're just going to measure around the widest point of your chest with one of these measuring tapes, and you're just gonna find what that measurement is. And then the second measurement you will need is your desired length. So I would measure that from like the armpit line, so basically where the dress is gonna sit, measure that down to however long you want it to be. I aimed for this dress to be like mid-thigh. I think that's a really cute length for it, but it's your call. Basically, this dress is a bunch of rectangles, and I've named them to hopefully make this easier. So there is the strap rectangle, the chest rectangle, the mid rectangle, and the skirt rectangle. So what you're gonna do is take down some measurements. Find your bust and write that down. Now find the ideal length of your dress and write that down. So you're gonna take your bust measurement and multiply that by 1.3 and write that number down. If it's got decimals, just round up. So I'm making this dress and their bust measurement is 35 inches. I multiplied that by 1.3 and I rounded it up and I got 46. I think the original measurement was 45.5, so I just rounded up to 46. Keep that measurement in mind, write it down, your best measurement times 1.3. Next thing you're gonna do is you're gonna take your total length measurement and you're gonna divide it by 3 and write that number down. So for the chest rectangle, you're going to make that half of the bust measurement. So whatever that was, your final measurement, divide that by 2. So for me, I had 46 down, I'm dividing that by 2, and I get 23. Write that down. This is the chest piece we're focusing on. So write down half of that. For me, it's 23. And then the next thing you're going to write down is a third of the total length. So take your total length number, for mine it was 27, and divide it by 3. I now have 9. So you've got 23 by 9. Now the 23, we can leave it as it is because we've taken into account seam allowance by multiplying this by 1.3. You don't need to add any extra seam allowance to it. But for the length of it, the 9 measurement, we're gonna add an inch so that there's half an inch on the top and half an inch on the bottom. So it's not 9 anymore, it's 10. So for our chest rectangle, there will be 2 of them, but the measurement for the chest rectangle is now 23 by 10. So write that down, write down like chest piece, blank by blank, bust, all the divisions by length. Next piece you're gonna focus on is the mid piece. And so the length part again, the 9, which became 10, that's gonna stay the same. You're gonna write that down. But the width of it, we're gonna multiply the old bust number that we just had by 1.5. So we've gone from 23, which was the width of the chest piece, multiplying that by 1.5. So for mine, we had 23 and now it's 35. So our dimensions for our mid piece is going to be the same length as the chest piece, and for the width, we're going to multiply the chest piece width by 1.5. Now, the last piece of the actual dress is the skirt piece, and for that one, we're going to take the length again, but we're going to add an extra inch. Rather than just 1 inch, we're going to add 2. So For mine, again, the original like 27 divided by 3, we had 9. On the last 2 pieces, we added 1 inch, so it was 10. For this one, we're gonna add 2, so the length is 11. And then the width of it, same thing as before, we're gonna multiply the previous width by 1.5. So the width of the mid piece was 35. We're gonna multiply it by 1.5 again, and we're gonna get 53. Again, I think for both of these numbers, I rounded to the nearest whole number. So those are our pieces for this dress. I will include the measurements that I used for this one. This will fit like a small, medium person. If you wanna just make it based off of that, if that's your size, but this isn't too hard to figure out. I hope I'm explaining it well enough, but I'll have this all written somewhere to show. So those are the pieces of the actual dress. And then the last thing is the strap. So this is up to your personal choice. But for me, I make all my straps 24 inches, so they're really nice and long to tie up into a bow. And I like them to be inch wide. So I cut out 4 pieces that are 24 inches by 3. And those are all of our pieces. It's gonna take a while to cut them all out, so take your time, don't rush, you can do it. Okay, so I have just cut out all my pieces. It took like an hour. It takes such a long time. First thing I'm gonna do is sew all of my straps because I hate leaving that to last. It takes a long time and it's straightforward, so I just like to get it over with. Here is one strap piece. It's 24 by 3. And we're just gonna sew it up. So basically all we're going to do is fold it in half this way, iron that, and then sew the seam shut with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm gonna go iron this and I'll be right back. Okay, so I'm back with my 4 straps ironed flat along the long measurement. I'm gonna take my first one and like I said, I'm just gonna sew it together along the edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So because it was like all not folded over, all flat, it's 3 inches. When we sew it with the 1/2 inch seam allowance, the strap is gonna end up being 1 inch wide, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so I've just sewed that seam, and the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna sew the edge, and I'm gonna line up this edge with the 1/2 inch marker on my machine, and I'm just gonna sew across. And that's gonna seal the edge, and we're gonna turn it inside out with one of these instead of a safety pin, because we won't be able to turn it inside out with a safety pin. But this is just a turner. I bought like a pack of turners, but this is basically like a chopstick or a knitting needle, so you can use one of those if you don't have turners. But yeah, just sew off the edge at the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so that is sewn up, and now we're just gonna clip off the excess seam allowance from the side, the long seam, and the top. And now I'm gonna turn it inside out. So just grab this, sort of pull it open a little bit with your fingers. Obviously it won't actually pull open because it's sewn shut, but just try and turn it in a little bit to start. And then you'll take your turning stick and just push it inside of itself till it comes out the other end. Take the stick out, and now it's turned right side out, and it needs to be ironed. And we're also gonna sew a seam all the way around it so that it looks neat. But first I'm gonna do the same thing to the next 3 pieces. Okay, so I have just ironed all of my straps, and the next thing we need to do is, this isn't like 100% necessary. Obviously this will function as a strap as is, but it's nice to just sew a little seam all the way around it, around the top and around the other side, just like 1/8 of an inch from the edge, just to kind of seal it and help it lay flat and look nice. So I'll do that and then I'll show you what it looks like so that it makes a little bit more sense. Okay, so I'll show you what this looks like up close. And then once that's done to the other 3 straps, we are all done the straps. The next thing we're gonna do is focus on the chest piece. So I've got my 2 chest rectangles, the 10 by 23 inch rectangles. There's 2 of them here, and I've got them pinned together on the short ends, right sides together. And I'm just gonna sew them together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance on each of these seams. Alright, once you've done that, go ahead and finish your seams with a zigzag stitch, and I'm gonna finish mine with a serger. Remember, when you're doing a zigzag stitch, you've got to trim the seam allowance from 1/2 inch down to 1/4 inch before you zigzag it. Okay, so I'm now over at the ironing board, and I'm just gonna iron these seams flat. And I'm going to be doing a 1/2 inch double folded hem on just one of these sides, because the other one is going to be attached to the rest of the dress. So we're going to do this side here, and I'm going to fold this down by 1/2 inch, and we're going to do that all the way around, just a 1/2 inch hem. So around the entire length of this top piece, we're going to sew that, or sorry, iron that and pin it like this. You might not have to pin it if the fabric takes to the iron really well, like mine does. I'm just throwing a couple in here and there. This isn't the hem that we're gonna sew. We're gonna end up folding it under one more time, so it's like 1/4 of an inch. Just get this 1/2 inch hem down and pressed. Okay, so as you can see, I've come around to the other side. I have folded down this edge by 1/2 inch all the way around. And now I'm just going to tuck it under one more time. I'm also gonna cut this serger thread. So I'm gonna tuck this 1/2 inch hem underneath into itself and press and pin it like this all the way around. And you can throw more pins into this seam because, or sorry, this hem, because this is going to be the one that we actually sew. So I have just made a double folded hem all the way around this edge, and I'm just going to sew it. And that will be the very top hem of the dress. All right. Back at the sewing machine, gonna sew this hem down. I'm using my 01 stitch because it's slightly to the side, and that will help me line up the seam with like the very edge of this hem so that it's as far over as possible, and I think it just looks better. Okay, so now that we've got our top piece, chest piece, these two sewn together, and they've got a nice little double folded hem on the top, we are going to attach the straps. So what we're gonna do is each strap is there's gonna be 2 on the front and 2 on the back because they tie up to meet like on the shoulder. Each strap is gonna be 5 inches from the armpit, and this works really well. I've made so many tops in this style, and that seems to work very consistently along like lots of different sizes. Obviously it depends on people's bodies, but generally like 5 inches from the armpit is kind of where you want a strap to be. And obviously it's going to be shirred up together, so once it's all like bunched up and the strap is here, it'll look like it's really close, but it will stretch out like quite a bit with the body, and it will be in the perfect spot most of the time, like 90% of the time. So what we're gonna do is flip this inside out, and I will angle the camera down so you can see what I'm doing. Here is the top inside out, and here is one of our seams. You can see it pretty clearly because the shirring thread doesn't match. So I'm going to measure from that edge 5 inches. So that's right here. And we're gonna take a strap, and this is like not the nicely sewed up edge. I'm just gonna place it right on the 5 inches, and the end of the strap is sort of in the middle of like the hem. So if you're picturing the hem, it's 1/4 of an inch. There's like the very top of it, and then there's the very bottom of it where it's sewn. Place this like right in the middle and pin it. So the strap is facing downward. The reason being is we're gonna end up sewing right there, right over the line that's holding the hem in place, so the same spot, and we're gonna flip it up and sew over the top there so that you can't see the raw edge of the strap on the inside of the dress. So there's one, and then here's the other edge. So we'll find 5 inches from that one, and same deal, pin it in place, and then flip this over and do the same thing for the other 2 straps. Now, like I said, we're gonna sew this to the dress along the line that's already there from where we sewed the hem down. I hope that makes sense. I'll try and show it while I'm sewing. I hope you can see here. Here's the seam from my hem, and I'm just gonna find that line as I'm sewing this strap on. It's like lined up with that previous seam, you know? Okay, so the next thing we're gonna do is flip it up this way and sew along here. So it was here that we just sewed, and now we're flipping it this way, and we're sewing right along the top of the piece, you know? So there's a lot of loose threads, but that's how it looks on the front. And now we just need to do that to the other 3 straps. Okie dokie, here is where we are now. We have completed and sewn on the straps to the chest pieces, which we have sewn together, finished the seams, and sewed a double folded hem along the top. Yay! Hi, I just wanted to add that at this point you can just sew another double folded hem along the bottom edge and then skip to this time where we do the shirring, and you can just make an Elle top if you don't want to make the whole dress, or keep going and learn how to make the dress. Hi, it's a new day, I'm back to finish this dress. So yesterday we got to finishing sewing up the chest piece with the little hem and attaching the straps. Today we're going to attach the mid piece and the skirt piece with their gathering, and we're gonna shirr the chest piece. So here I have two mid piece rectangles, and I've already just sewed them together and finished the seams off camera because it's pretty straightforward. It's the same as we did for the chest piece, except we don't have to do any hemming on this one. So we've got this together, and now we just have to gather it because this is wider than the chest piece. So we need to gather it down to that original, gather this down to the width of the chest piece. So let's get our basting stitches on here. I'm gonna set my stitch length as high as possible, and I'm gonna sew 2 basting stitches. I did make a little video about this, like gathering, but we're just gonna get this at the 1/2 inch mark and carefully sew a very, very long line all the way around of a basting stitch. And we're going to be careful to not back stitch at the beginning or the end. This is going to take a little while. When you get to this other seam, just go right over it. Okay, so there's my basting stitch at 1/2 inch, and now I'm gonna put another one between that stitch and the end, so at 1/4 inch. Do the exact same thing all the way around again. So I've got my 2 basting stitches done, and now we've got to gather this. So like I said, this in a flat lay sense is 35 inches long. Altogether it's 70, but it's 35 inches long. Actually, sorry, 34 because of the seam allowances. And we have to get it down to the flat lay measurement of the chest piece, which for mine is 22. So just find the edge where your stitches are and start gathering. We're gonna grab the ones from the bottom, the ones that came out of the bobbin of your machine, and just start pulling it all along. And you can go from both ends. Like, this is where I started my basting stitches, on the right side of the seam, and they end on the left side of the seam. You can go from both ends. You don't have to pull it all the way around from just these 2 threads. But I usually just start with one side and get it all nice and gathered from here to the seam on the other side, and then I do the other side. I hope that made sense. Okay, so I've got gathering running from one end to the other, and I'm just gonna measure it and see how long we're at. So this is 19, so it's a little bit too gathered. So I'm just gonna loosen that off a little. And I don't know if this goes without saying, but you definitely want to make sure that the gathers, the little bunched up parts, are pretty evenly spread out throughout the entirety of this thing. You don't want more in one place and less in another. So now that's around 23 inches, and I'm going to start doing the other side. Okay, so once we've gotten the mid piece down to the width of our chest piece, we have to attach the 2. So we want them to be right sides together. So I've got the outside seam of the chest piece facing out and the inside seam of the mid piece facing out, and I'm going to line them up. By their side seams. So just finding the side seam of the chest piece and the side seam of the mid piece and pinning that together on both sides. And then we're just gonna continue pinning all the way around. And at this point, you can kind of adjust this, the gathering, if it needs to be adjusted more. And yeah, just line up those two edges and pin together. All right, so I've just pinned the front side together, and I've just got to do the same thing on the back, and then we'll be good to sew it. I've just pinned my gathered mid piece to my chest piece, and I'm going to sew them together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So make sure you set your machine back to your regular standard stitch. You're not on the basting stitch anymore, or you'll have to redo it. So I'll set this back down to 2.2. And we're good to go. I recommend taking this really slowly. You want to make sure that your 1/2 inch seam allowance that you're giving here is lined up with the first basting stitch we did at 1/2 inch. If your sewing is to the right of that stitch, the basting stitch will show through on the front side of your dress. Just take care that you are sewing right on that first basting stitch, or even slightly to the left of it. Okay, sorry for the white balance shift that just happened. I realized I was on like tungsten mode this whole time and I didn't need to be. Anyway, I just went and did the gathering on the skirt piece. You're gonna do the exact same thing as you just did on the mid piece, except you're gonna take it down to the width of the full mid piece rather than the bust piece, you know? So like, for my mid piece, it was 34 inches wide, and I took it down to 22. For the skirt piece, it was 52 inches wide, and I took it down to 34, flat, not like all the way around, you know? So yeah, I just did that, but I'll show you what this should be looking like at this point. So here is the dress so far. We've got the chest piece and then the attached gathered mid piece, and I didn't film this part, but once I sewed it on, I just finished the seam with my serger. You can finish your seam with a zigzag stitch after you very, very carefully trim the seam allowance. Make sure you don't accidentally cut into the dress. I have done that before and it really sucked. So yeah, now I'm just gonna do the same thing with this skirt piece. I'm gonna attach it to the bottom of the mid piece. Hi, okay, I just finished sealing the seam of the skirt piece onto the body, and here is how we're looking right now. So as you can see, we've got 3 nice, pretty gathered tiers. So next step, shirring. The first step of shirring, I recommend, if you haven't already watched it, watch the video that I did on this. That's up on Patreon, but here we go. So when we're shirring, I find it best to place the stitches, rows of shirring 1 inch apart. You can do less, 1/2 inch apart looks really good too, but it takes a really long time, and I like the look of the bigger gaps in the shirring than 1/2 inch, so I do 1 inch apart. And the way we do this is by taking a piece of tailor's chalk and a ruler. I'm using this, and so what we do is just lie your dress as flat as you can get it, and we're gonna mark lines with our tailor's chalk using the ruler 1 inch apart all the way down. Here is the first row of shirring, 1 inch from the top, so I'm just gonna take my chalk and draw a straight line. Now just move the ruler down. If you don't have one of these, I'd highly recommend getting it. I use it for sewing all the time. They sell these at Fabricland and like whatever other fabric store you can find. But yeah, they're really helpful because these are all marked by 1 inch. So I know that this line here, I can line it up with the chalk marking I've just made because this is see-through, and I can just really easily draw a line 1 inch away from that line. So just continue doing this until you're as close to this little seam here as possible. Okay, so once we get to this point, it's gonna be hard to draw another line so close to this seam that's been gathered, so I'm just gonna leave it, and we're just gonna eyeball it when we get there with the shirring. So I've got 7 lines here, and we're just gonna flip it over and do the same thing on the back. All right, so we're almost done with our dress. The last thing we need to do is, well, not quite the last thing. We're gonna do the shirring. So again, if you haven't watched my tutorial on shirring yet, you should probably check it out because it will help you. But we're going to do that now. So I'm gonna grab my elastic thread. Now I'm actually in the frame. Okay, so we're gonna take our elastic thread in this nice brown color, and I'm going to gently thread the bobbin without pulling it tight at all. Just gonna wrap it around as much as I can get on there. We're definitely gonna have to like refill the bobbin at some point, so while you're doing this, like, be aware of how full it is because it's just kind of a pain if you run out in the middle of like a line. Okay, so I will put this in the machine and thread it. Put the little bobbin lid back on, and I'm going to put my thread tension up just a little bit and stitch length up to 4. Okay, so I'm gonna find the first line, and I'm gonna work from here to here. So the first line that I did, not right up next to the seam where we attached like the mid piece. So I'm gonna sew my first line of shirring as close to that as possible. Yeah, just make sure, okay, I don't know how to say this. So on the inside, there's like the seam, right, where like your zigzag stitches. Make sure that that is folded towards the rest of the dress, not towards the top. Otherwise you'll be sewing this shirring stitch through it and it probably won't elasticize enough because it will be too thick. So as you're sewing really close to that, just ensure that it is flipped towards the rest of the dress and you're just sewing through the one layer of the top piece. So I'm going to set my machine up, Going to do a couple front stitches and a couple back. And then we're gonna go doing our first shirring line. And like I said in the shirring how-to video, hold the fabric flat, don't pull it really tight, but just make sure that you're holding it so that it doesn't bunch up as you go. Okay, I've just come to the end of this first line of shirring. So I have come to the end, back stitched, forward stitched, and I am taking my needle out, cutting the threads. Do that after each one, otherwise it will start to shirr up sideways. So we've got our first row in there. And depending on the fabric you're using, the first row of shirring might not look like it's doing much, but it's okay, it will eventually. As long as you're using something thin enough for this. I have done shirring on up to like a 6-ounce linen, which is pretty heavy. Wouldn't go any heavier than that. Probably wouldn't recommend going any heavier than a 5-ounce linen if you're gonna use linen. Cotton gauze like this is perfect. It's really hard to sew with cotton gauze, like in general. But if you do have the hang of it, shirring with it is amazing. It takes so well. So yeah. Now I'm gonna start on my next row, which is gonna be the row that actually has a line of chalk on it to follow. So it's a lot easier. I don't need to be folding down an inner seam while I do this one. So again, I'm gonna start at the side seam because there's a couple layers of fabric there to hold my initial and final back stitch and forward stitch when I start this row of shirring. Let's do that. And just remember to hold the fabric so that it stays flat, especially now that we are adding rows of shirring. It's gonna start bunching up. So just make sure you're pulling it, not tight, but flat as you're going around. So you can start to see now that with the 2 layers of shirring, it's really starting to gather there. All right, so I just finished that row and I'm gonna pull my needle out, cut the threads again, and then go back in for all of my next rows. Okay, so I just finished all of this shirring and here is where we're at right now. This is how it should look more or less. You can put your rows of shirring closer together, further apart. You can bring them further up the top if you'd like. But yeah, more or less, this is the dress, almost complete. The last thing we need to do is a hem on the bottom. I don't think I'm gonna film myself doing that, but I will show you the fully completed dress once it's done. For the bottom hem, we added an extra inch. So like for this mid piece, for example, we made it 10, right? So we had an extra inch on top of the 9 to make up for the 1/2 inch used to sew here and the 1/2 inch used to sew here. But for this one, we added extra. So we've used up a 1/2 inch here and we have another whole 1.5 inches for the bottom hem. So you can do a pretty big hem if you'd like, which I think looks really good on dresses. So that is what I'm gonna do. And I will show you when it's complete. If you are unclear how to do a hem, just check out my hemming video. All right, sorry about the lighting, the sun went down, but here is the Elle dress, all complete. It's got the nice little adjustable straps, little shirt, top, this first gathered layer, and the last one. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope it inspires you to make this or something like this. You can customize it all you want, do whatever you want with it. It's your call, it's your dress. So good luck. I hope that you make this and you have fun. And yeah, thank you so much for watching.